Few people know, but there's an ancient book that was considered so dangerous that it ended up banned from the world's most influential traditions. A text that retells the story of Genesis and Exodus, but in such a bold way that rabbis and Christian leaders preferred to hide it from the majority. This is the Book of Jubilees, also called Little Genesis. Now here's the controversy. What if I told you that this book claims that the laws existed before Moses? That even Abraham, Noah, and the angels kept the Sabbath, purity, and even circumcision? That changes everything. Because if the laws were already eternal, then the idea of a new covenant, as a rupture, loses its power. Do you realize the magnitude of the impact? And it doesn't stop there. Jubilees rejects the lunar calendar, still used today by Jews and Muslims, and advocates a perfect 364-day solar calendar, in which the festivals never change location. Now imagine, if the time we follow is wrong, aren't we also living outside the rhythm of the universe itself? This is the kind of knowledge that shakes certainties, shakes traditions, and provokes scholars and religious scholars to this day. For this reason, Jubilees was forgotten, erased, and labeled heresy. But at the same time, it survived hidden, preserved only in the Ethiopian Church, like a secret waiting to be rediscovered. And the question is, what exactly was in this book that made so many people want to ban it? Today you'll understand why Jubilees continues to be seen as forbidden knowledge, and how it can change the way you view time, law, and even destiny. Few people have heard of the Book of Jubilees, but it is considered one of the most mysterious gems of ancient Jewish literature. Also known as Little Genesis, it retells the stories of Genesis and Exodus, but with a wealth of detail that surprises even the most studious. It's like a parallel version, opening doors to secrets hidden in tradition. Imagine watching a movie you already know but with extended scenes and dialogue never revealed. That's what it feels like to immerse yourself in this text. Probably written in the 2nd century BC, the Book of Jubilees presents a narrative that not only repeats the Bible, but also expands it with unexpected elements. In it, each event is placed within a grand cosmic plan, connected to time and the Jubilee. The author didn't intend to write something new, but to show that there were deeper dimensions to what was already known. It's almost like a map revealing secret passages within familiar territory. What's fascinating is how this book explores the idea of destiny and revelation. It's not just about Moses, Abraham, or Noah, but about affirming that their lives were part of a larger cycle, governed by divine laws that existed even before they were born. This creates in the reader a sense that nothing is by chance, that even small choices are part of an invisible mechanism. It's a call to reflection. Aren't our own lives also written in some eternal script? Furthermore, the Book of Jubilees adds elements that today we would call spiritual background. It speaks of angels participating in events, of divine instructions on purity, of visions that go beyond the surface of the narrative. It's as if the stories we've known since childhood gained a new layer of depth, full of codes, symbols, and secrets. For those who enjoy exploring the unspoken in Scripture, this book is a real treat. Now, imagine that this text was preserved in some traditions, forgotten in others, and even rejected in certain circles. The question remains, why did such a rich book, so bold in its way of retelling the story, end up marginalized? This answer takes shape as we better understand its historical origins and the groups that truly valued its teachings. The Book of Jubilees did not emerge from nowhere. It was born during a turbulent time in Israel's history. We are talking about the Second Temple period, when different Jewish groups debated the correct way to live their faith. Among them, the Essenes stood out as radical defenders of purity and a perfect solar calendar, which they considered superior to the lunar calendar used by others. In this context, Jubilees appears almost as a manifesto, defending a distinct vision of law and time. These groups believed that fidelity to God was not limited to the temple in Jerusalem, but to a rigorous discipline that organized even the details of daily life. Jubilees reflected this very mindset. Every feast, every Sabbath, every practice of purity was seen as something cosmic, inscribed on the heavenly tablets. Nothing was casual. Religion was more than a set of rituals. It was a struggle to preserve holiness in a corrupt world. It's interesting to note how this context explains the emphasis on laws that, according to Jubilees, already existed since the patriarchs, such as circumcision, dietary rules, and Sabbath observance. By stating that Abraham, Jacob, and even Noah already obeyed these norms, The book reinforced the idea that such practices were not human inventions, but eternal commands. For the Essenes, this made perfect sense. They saw themselves as guardians of a pure tradition, threatened by worldly changes. If we apply this to practical life, we can consider how often we must choose between following the crowd or maintaining firm principles. Jubilees reflects this dilemma. It teaches us that, in times of spiritual crisis, more than words are needed. A lifestyle that reflects discipline and purpose is required. Imagine, for example, the difference between someone who simply believes and someone who structures their time around that belief. The impact is completely different. Therefore, understanding the origins of this text is like opening a window into the mindset of those who refuse to yield to the cultural and religious pressures of their time. But the story of Jubilees doesn't end there. On the contrary, it follows a surprising path, finding a peculiar destiny that would allow it to survive in only one place in the world, the Ethiopian Church. While in much of the world the Book of Jubilees was forgotten or even rejected, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church it found a home. There, it was considered canonical, that is, an official part of Holy Scripture. This was no accident. The Ethiopian tradition has always maintained a deep spirituality, open to texts that other communities had neglected. Thus, Jubilees became one of the pillars of the Ethiopian canon, read and preserved with respect for centuries. This preservation has something providential about it. Think about it, how many ancient books have been lost to time, devoured by dust or war? Yet Jubilees survived, precisely in a region that has always been on the margins of the great cultural axis of the West. It's almost as if it had been hidden in a natural vault, protected by the mountains and isolation of Ethiopia, awaiting the right moment to be rediscovered by the academic world. The importance of this is enormous. If it weren't for Ethiopian fidelity, we might not have complete access to this text today. Fragments of Jubilees were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but only the Ethiopian tradition has preserved the entire work. This shows how different peoples hold keys to mysteries that others overlook. It's a reminder that truth can be hidden where we least expect it. In practice, this teaches us to value what often seems small or out of the spotlight. Who would have thought that the Ethiopian Church, far from the focus of the great theological disputes of the West, would have in its hands a book so laden with revelations about angels, the Sabbath, the patriarchs, and even eschatological visions? It's like that simple person who preserves ancient wisdom that academia has forgotten. But this preservation also raises another question. If one group valued Jubilees so highly, why did others reject it? What prevented rabbis and Christian leaders from accepting this text into their canons? The answer is linked primarily to a detail that directly affected the notion of time in the heart of Jewish liturgy: the lunar calendar. The Book of Jubilees is categorical. The lunar calendar is untrustworthy. The text even says that it confuses the times and diverts the festivals from their true meaning. For the author, relying on the moon meant allowing instability to dictate the rhythm of spiritual life. After all, the moon is constantly changing, never maintaining a fixed shape, and this, to them, represented disorder. It was like trying to organize life based on something that never rests. In the view of Jubilees, using the lunar calendar was more than a technical issue. It was a spiritual error. Because if time is linked to fate, the celestial tablets, and the divine plan, then it needs to reflect order, not confusion. Imagine trying to mark someone's birthday on a calendar that moves every year. Soon the dates would be lost, and so would the memory of important things. For them, this was what happened when Israel adhered to the lunar cycle. This point helps understand why the book was so controversial. The Jews connected to the temple in Jerusalem followed the lunar calendar, and Jubilees radically rejected it. In other words, it wasn't just a difference of opinion, but an affront to official religious authority. It's as if someone today said that the entire system of timekeeping the world follows is wrong and needs to be replaced. You can imagine the scale of the conflict. To apply this to our daily lives, think about how many get lost because they lack solid organization. Those who follow unstable rules live at the mercy of circumstances, while those guided by firm principles have clarity and direction. Jubilees uses the lunar calendar as a symbol of this. When you rely on what changes too much, your faith also weakens. On the other hand, when you rely on what is constant, the path becomes firmer. But then the big question arises. If the lunar calendar was rejected, what would be the true standard of time to align the people of Israel with divine purpose? The answer, according to Jubilees, lay in the solar calendar, a system that reflected mathematical perfection and ensured that feasts and Sabbaths always remained on the same day. In the Book of Jubilees, the 364-day solar calendar is presented as the true order of time. It is described as perfect because it is divided into 4 seasons of 91 days, totaling 52 exact weeks. This means that each year always begins and ends on the same day of the week, without slippage or confusion. For the author, this precision reflected the harmony of creation, something that could never be achieved by the lunar calendar. This vision transformed the calendar into much more than a system of dates. He was a divine revelation inscribed on the heavenly tablets. Each feast, each Sabbath, each cycle was an opportunity to align the people with God's eternal purpose. For them, losing this order meant losing touch with the cosmic plan. It was like a symphony being out of tune. No matter how small the error, the whole ensemble was compromised. Interestingly, this idea of fixed time gave security and predictability to religious life. Imagine knowing that Easter, Pentecost, or the Day of Atonement would always fall on the same day of the week year after year. This created stability, eliminating doubt and dispute. In a society marked by uncertainty, this structure brought peace. It's like organizing a calendar that never goes out of date because it's already engraved in the very fabric of the universe. In practice, this principle teaches us the value of constancy. When a person commits to fixed spiritual routines, such as prayer times, days of rest, and habits of discipline, they create an environment for growth. The Jubilee solar calendar was not just a theory, but an invitation to an orderly life. It's like maintaining a healthy diet. There's no point in being inconsistent. What transforms is regularity. But if time is so closely linked to divine order, who would ensure that this order was observed? For Jubilees, there were beings charged with maintaining this harmony. The angels who not only conveyed messages but also guarded the rhythm of time and the execution of the law. In the Book of Jubilees, angels play a much broader role than simply messengers. They are portrayed as guardians of the cosmic order, responsible for recording events and overseeing the fulfillment of the law. Some are directly linked to the control of time and the solar calendar, ensuring that the rhythm of creation follows the divine plan. Others act as warriors, confronting the forces of evil and protecting the people of Israel. This perspective completely changes the way we understand spirituality. While many today see angels merely as comforting figures, Jubilees shows them as active agents in the destiny of humanity. They not only observe, but intervene to ensure that the heavenly rules are fulfilled. It is as if they were invisible administrators of a great kingdom, each with a specific function that upholds the harmony of the universe. A fascinating detail is that the angels in Jubilees also serve as teachers. They are described as teaching laws to men like Noah and Abraham, instructing them in practices of purity, diet, and Sabbath keeping. This shows that divine knowledge was not only delivered in the Exodus, but was already circulating long before, transmitted by these celestial beings. It's like having spiritual mentors who reveal secrets even before the people are ready to officially receive them. If we bring this to everyday life, we can think of angels as symbols of what helps us maintain discipline and purpose. Just as they kept time, each person can cultivate practical angels. Alarms that remind us to pray, planners that organize the week, or even people who warn us when we're straying from our path. The message is clear. No one grows spiritually without support and supervision. But this role of angels points to something even more intriguing. If they were already transmitting laws before Moses, could it be that figures like Abraham, Noah, and Jacob were already practicing commandments that many believe began only at Sinai? The Book of Jubilees presents a bold idea. The laws did not begin with Moses at Sinai, but were already known and practiced by the patriarchs. According to the text, from Adam through Noah, Abraham, and Jacob, principles such as the Sabbath, purity, circumcision, and even diet were already observed. This is because these laws were not human inventions, but were recorded in the heavenly tablets, accessible through the revelation of the angels. This view breaks common logic. Many imagine that laws were born only at the time of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. However, Jubilees affirms that obedience has always been part of human destiny. When Abraham circumcised himself, for example, he was not creating something new, but merely renewing a commandment that had existed since the beginning. It is as if the patriarchs were guardians of an eternal tradition, even if the people in general had forgotten it. This makes us reflect on how solid principles do not depend on time. If something is true, it spans generations. Think of values like honesty or fidelity. They didn't emerge yesterday, but they carry weight in any culture and time. Likewise, the divine laws that appear in Jubilees are presented as immutable pillars of creation, long before Israel was formally constituted as a nation. In practice, this challenges us not to treat spiritual commandments as mere institutional rules. Just as Noah was instructed to live holy lives amid a corrupt generation, we too are called to uphold principles even when the environment around us is unfavorable. It's like someone who chooses to observe the weekly Sabbath in a fast-paced world. They not only obey but also resist. And if these laws existed before Moses, the natural question is, where were they recorded? How was it possible that men from such ancient times knew them so clearly? Jubilees answers by presenting a fascinating concept, that of the heavenly tablets, an eternal record that contained the entire divine plan from creation onward. One of the most intriguing concepts in the Book of Jubilees is that of the heavenly tablets. The text describes that long before Moses received the Torah at Sinai, a divine record already existed where all laws, events, and destinies were written. Nothing escaped these tablets, from creation through the flood, to the future apocalypse and the final judgment. It is like a vast cosmic archive, guarded by angels and accessible to the chosen. This concept conveys a powerful idea. History is not free, it is guided. Every detail of human life is part of a larger narrative, already inscribed in this divine record. Thus, when the patriarchs observe the Sabbath or when Abraham practices circumcision, they are not innovating, but simply living something that was already planned. This gives cosmic weight to the simplest choices. Nothing is small when it has already been recorded in the heart of the universe. The heavenly tablets are also presented as a guarantee of order against chaos. If the solar calendar was the mathematical expression of this harmony, the tablets were its spiritual essence. Everything that happens has a place, time, and purpose. It's almost like a universal clock that never slows down, never advances. This comforts but also creates accountability. If everything is already written, were our failures also foreseen? This is the tension that Jubilees awakens. We can bring this to practical life in very simple ways. Think of how we record appointments in a planner or digital calendar. This act not only organizes, but also provides clarity about what needs to be done. The heavenly tablets would be the eternal version of this idea. A divine, immutable Google Calendar that guides both angels and humans toward purpose. This example helps to understand how the ancients viewed time and law as inseparable. And it is precisely in this context that the Book of Jubilees presents Sabbath keeping as something not only human but cosmic. After all, if even the angels observe this commandment on the eternal tablets, how could humans treat it lightly? The Book of Jubilees describes the Sabbath as something far beyond a simple day of human rest. It is presented as part of creation itself, a commandment that existed before any law was given to Moses. The text states that even the angels observe the Sabbath, for it is inscribed on the heavenly tablets as an eternal rhythm. This gives the Sabbath a cosmic dimension. It is not cultural, it is universal. This perspective completely changes the way we view time. The Sabbath, in this context, is not just a weekend, but an opportunity to align with the heartbeat of the universe itself. When a person stops to rest, they are not just caring for their body, but participating in an act of communion with the divine order established since creation. It is like entering into the rhythm of a song that has been playing since the beginning of time. Furthermore, the Sabbath in Jubilees is a sign of purity and holiness. Keeping it means recognizing that the world turns not only by human effort, but by the will of God. Think of someone who never takes a break. At some point, the body, mind, and even faith wear out. The Sabbath is seen as a protection against this self-sufficiency, a reminder that even the Creator rested. It is both discipline and liberation. In practice, this perspective can transform the way we view rest. Instead of treating it as laziness or luxury, we can see it as a spiritual principle that sustains the balance of life. Imagine setting aside a fixed time each week to disconnect from pressures, strengthen family bonds, and dedicate moments to prayer. This attitude echoes the logic of Jubilees and brings order to everyday chaos. But if the Sabbath was observed since creation, this raises another fascinating question. How did the patriarchs live this principle in their own stories? Jubilees add surprising details about figures like Abraham, showing how his life was marked not only by faith but by concrete acts of resistance against idolatry. In the Book of Jubilees, Abraham's life takes on new colors and details not found in the traditional biblical text. He is not only the man called to leave Ur, but also a spiritual reformer who radically broke with his family's idolatry. The text tells, for example, that Abraham destroyed his father's idols, showing courage in confronting a religious system that everyone accepted as normal. This act marks the beginning of his journey as someone chosen for something greater. This detail of the destruction of the idols carries tremendous symbolic weight. It wasn't just about breaking statues, but about rejecting the mentality of an entire generation. Abraham refused to live in a world where creation was confused with the Creator. By putting an end to domestic idolatry, he positioned himself as a man who sought purity and obedience to the eternal laws already inscribed on the heavenly tablets. It was a spiritual rupture with cosmic implications. This story also teaches us something practical. To move forward, it is often necessary to break the modern idols that rise up in our lives. They are not stone statues but can be addictions, dependencies, or even an obsession with money. Like Abraham, each person can ask themselves, what needs to be torn down for the divine purpose to manifest in me? It is a reflection that directly affects our routine and choices. Jubilees shows Abraham as someone who not only believed, but who acted concretely. His faith was not theoretical, it was practical. He obeyed the Sabbath, kept the principles of diet and circumcision, and lived in covenant with God even before the formal giving of the Torah. It is as if he were a prototype of Israel, a foretaste of the people who would be born in the Exodus. His life showed that the laws were not novelties but eternal truths. And if Abraham was an example of a rupture against idolatry, Jubilees also expands on more obscure stories in the Bible, such as the fall of the rebellious angels, the so-called Watchers who gave rise to the Nephilim. This section connects the story of the patriarchs to a much broader spiritual drama, involving heaven and earth. The Book of Jubilees impressively expands on the brief account in Genesis 6 of the angels who left their home. Known as the Watchers, they descended to earth attracted by the daughters of men, giving birth to the dreaded Nephilim. But the text goes further. It describes how this transgression was not just an act of desire, but a cosmic rebellion that corrupted all creation. It was as if a rift had opened between heaven and earth. These fallen angels taught mankind forbidden practices, from witchcraft to forms of violence never before seen. The result was a society steeped in corruption, where purity and divine order were systematically challenged. Jubilees paints this picture as a time when evil seemed limitless, setting the stage for the Great Flood. It is a narrative that reveals not only human error but also hidden spiritual influences. This interpretation makes us reflect on how evil often arises not only from within but is also fueled by external forces. Jubilees shows that spiritual struggle is real, that there are voices and influences that attempt to distort the law and divert us from our purpose. In today's world, this can be seen in ideologies that trivialize eternal values, or even in vices that spread like invisible currents. The fall of the Watchers is a symbol of this. An interesting detail is that, in Jubilees, the faithful angels take an active role in combating these rebels. It is not a balanced struggle but a war in which divine justice prevails. This reminds the reader that, although evil tries to infiltrate, there is always resistance from heaven. It is like a company facing internal corruption but counting on incorruptible auditors to restore order. The difference is that here the auditor is God himself. But if the Watchers and the Nephilim brought such corruption, the inevitable question arises, how could creation be purified? Jubilees points to the answer in the most significant event of biblical antiquity, seen not only as punishment, but as an act of restoration, the flood. In the Book of Jubilees, the flood is much more than a simple global inundation. It is described as an act of cosmic purification, intended not only to judge corrupt humanity but also to eliminate the influence of the evil spirits left behind by the Nephilim. Thus, the flood is seen as a kind of divine reset, cleansing the earth so that the order inscribed on the heavenly tablets could be restored. This detail changes the way we view the episode. It's not just about waters covering mountains, but a spiritual battle being waged on a universal scale. The chaos brought by the Watchers had polluted creation, and only radical intervention could restore balance. The flood, therefore, was not only destruction but also liberation. It marked the end of an era of violence and the beginning of a new opportunity for humanity. Jubilees presents Noah as a central figure in this process. He is not only the builder of the ark, but also someone who received instructions from angels on how to preserve purity, diet, and the covenant with God after the catastrophe. In other words, Noah was the guardian of continuity, a new patriarch who carried with him not only the animals but also the memory of the law. This reinforces the idea that faithfulness transcends generations. If we apply this interpretation to the present, we can see the flood as a metaphor for the crises we face. How often does life seem to be submerged in problems, demanding a new beginning? Just as Noah built the ark, obeying every detail, we too need to build refuges of discipline and faith in times of chaos. Reading, praying, fasting, or even reorganizing our routine can become our scaffolding for spiritual survival. But even after this purification, Jubilees shows that evil has not completely disappeared. A figure emerges as a persistent accuser, demanding space to continue testing humanity. This character, named Mastema, would become one of the most intriguing and controversial elements of the work. Among the most mysterious characters in the Book of Jubilees is Mastema, a figure closely reminiscent of the biblical Satan. He appears as an accuser, an adversary, and even as one who asks God for permission to test humanity. However, unlike an independent enemy, Mastema acts under divine sovereignty, fulfilling a function within the destiny already inscribed in the heavenly tablets. This makes him an uncomfortable but unavoidable presence in the narrative. In Jubilees, Mastema is not just a symbol of evil. He has a voice, intentions, and a kind of right granted to act at certain times. He is the one who rises up against the patriarchs, trying to divert them from their mission. He is like a prosecutor in a courtroom, always looking for flaws to accuse. This role reminds us that the spiritual life is not lived on neutral ground, but constantly tested. One of the most striking examples is when Mastema asks to test Abraham's faith in the episode of the sacrifice of Isaac. There, the test is not just about human trust, but about a spiritual conflict between obedience and accusation. This shows how Jubilees gives depth to stories we already know, revealing invisible layers of the biblical drama. It is like watching a familiar scene, but now with cameras revealing the behind the scenes. Applying this perspective today, Mastema symbolizes all the voices that try to undermine our faith and trust. They are those thoughts of doubt, disguised temptations, or even external pressures that push us away from our purpose. Jubilees teaches us that these tests do not arise by chance. They are part of a larger picture where resistance strengthens character. Like the patriarchs, we are called to persevere even when the battle seems unfair. But the most emblematic episode of this action occurs precisely during the ultimate test of Abraham's life, when Mastema challenges the divine promise. This moment is described vividly in Jubilees and involves not only the patriarch but also the intervention of angels in the spiritual conflict. In the Book of Jubilees, the famous episode of the sacrifice of Isaac takes on an even more dramatic dimension. It is not just a story about Abraham's faith, but a spiritual conflict between Mastema's accusation and the intervention of the angels. The test is presented as part of an invisible battle, where evil forces try to discredit the patriarch's obedience and heavenly forces strengthen him to resist. It is a true miniature eschatological stage. Abraham emerges as the supreme example of obedience, even when everything seemed illogical. Imagine the dilemma, sacrificing the son who represented the divine promise itself. For Jubilees, this act was not just an individual test, but a cosmic revelation, man's faith against the adversary's accusations. It's as if Abraham were being watched by all of creation, carrying in his hands not only Isaac's life but also the future of Israel. The striking detail is the active presence of the angels in the story. While Mastema incited the test, the angels appeared as protectors, ready to prevent the destruction from being accomplished. This reinforces the idea that biblical history does not only take place on the human plane, but is always surrounded by invisible spiritual movements. Every choice, every act of faith, echoes both in heaven and on earth. This episode teaches us that great trials often reveal not only who we are, but also who is with us. When we face impossible dilemmas, we need to remember that there are invisible forces cheering and interceding for us. Just as Abraham found support in the decisive moment, we too can find strength through prayer, reading the Torah, and spiritual discipline. These practices are like the angels who sustain us in times of crisis. But Jubilees doesn't stop there. It shows that Israel's destiny, including even slavery in Egypt and the future Exodus, was already inscribed in the heavenly tablets. In other words, nothing was a matter of chance. Everything followed a plan laid out from the beginning. In the Book of Jubilees, the Exodus is not just a historical event, but an event already written in the heavenly tablets from the beginning. Slavery in Egypt and the liberation of the people of Israel are presented as part of a cosmic destiny, inevitable and necessary to fulfill the divine plan. In other words, nothing that occurred there was a matter of chance. Everything was already foreseen as part of a larger cycle of history. This completely changes the way we look at oppression and liberation. For Jubilees, the pain of captivity had a purpose: to prepare Israel to receive the Torah and assume their role as the chosen people. Even suffering was part of a pedagogical plan. It's like a difficult stage of training that, though painful, strengthens the athlete for the race. Likewise, Israel was molded in the furnace of Egypt to fulfill its mission. This vision teaches us something profound. Crises are not always signs of abandonment, but can be steps in preparation. How often does a period of trial pave the way for a greater liberation? Jubilees shows that even tears can be aligned with a divine script. This brings hope, for it indicates that even the darkest valleys have a place in the eternal purpose. Furthermore, the predestined Exodus reinforces the centrality of the covenant. The departure from Egypt was not just a political liberation, but a spiritual one. It was the transition from a people enslaved by idolatry to a nation consecrated to the God of creation. Every detail, from the oppression to the victories, was part of the divine script written before the pharaohs even existed. This gives the story weight. It is not casual but sacred. And if even the suffering in Egypt was already written, how can we understand the signs that led to liberation? Jubilees answers by portraying the plagues of Egypt not simply as natural phenomena or isolated miracles, but as spiritual battles against the Egyptian gods themselves. In the Book of Jubilees, the plagues of Egypt are not seen merely as miracles or isolated punishments. They are presented as true spiritual battles, direct confrontations between the God of Israel and the Egyptian deities. Each plague, from the bloodshed in the Nile to the death of the firstborn, is described as a blow against the idolatry that sustained the empire. It wasn't just nature revolting, it was heaven at war with darkness. This detail makes for fascinating reading. The Exodus was not only a political liberation, but also a cosmic revelation. By striking the gods of Egypt, God was showing that their power was illusory, incapable of resisting the truth inscribed on the heavenly tablets. It was a public exposure of the weakness of evil. The people not only left free, but they learned that their Lord was greater than any visible or invisible power. The impact of this on practical life is enormous. How often do we face modern plagues that seem to dominate us? Addictions, injustices, oppressive systems. Jubilees reminds us that each of these struggles can be seen as a spiritual confrontation, in which resistance is not just a fight for survival, but an affirmation that truth is stronger than lies. Every victory, small or large, is a sign that God still acts on our behalf. Another important point is that the plagues had a pedagogical purpose, not only to free Israel but also to reveal who the true Lord of time and creation was. It is like a teacher who not only corrects the error, but teaches the lesson so clearly that it is never forgotten. After Egypt, no one could deny that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was above all forces. But the story does not end with liberation. Jubilees insists that the life of the people of Israel should be marked by purity and practices that had been present since the patriarchs, especially diet and holy customs, which revealed the continuity of an eternal law. The Book of Jubilees states that the rules of purity and diet did not begin with Moses, but were already known since the patriarchs. Noah, for example, was instructed to distinguish between clean and unclean animals after the flood. Abraham and Jacob also appear as men who respected the sanctity of food and daily life. This reinforces the idea that the law is not a cultural invention, but an eternal reflection of the heavenly tablets. This emphasis shows that food and the body were never seen as neutral. Eating what is permitted and avoiding what is unclean was part of spiritual discipline, as important as keeping the Sabbath or practicing circumcision. For Jubilees, the table was a daily altar where fidelity to God was revealed. Thus, diet became an act of obedience, not just a matter of health. In practice, this teaches that even the simplest choices carry spiritual weight. What we put before our eyes, what we allow into our minds and bodies, shapes our character. Just as Israel was separated by its diet, today we can reflect on the modern foods we consume, their contents, habits, and influences. Jubilees suggests that true liberation also begins with what we choose to reject. It is interesting to see how this principle appears in later traditions, such as among the Essenes, who followed strict rules of diet and purity. It was not just a matter of health, but of spiritual identity. Eating differently meant affirming that they belonged to another kingdom, and that their lives followed a different rhythm from the world around them. It was a practical way of keeping the flame of hope alive. But if diet and purity already marked the identity of the patriarchs, Jubilees further reinforces the idea that everything revolved around a chosen people. For the author, from creation, Israel already had a cosmic role within God's plan, something that placed it at the center of history. In the Book of Jubilees, the people of Israel are not just one nation among others, but the center of the divine plan since creation. The text affirms that Israel's choice was already inscribed on the heavenly tablets, long before human history unfolded. This means that its identity was not born of historical chance, but of an eternal decision. Israel was not an improvisation but a cosmic project. This vision places each biblical event in a different perspective. When Abraham is called, when Jacob fights, or when the Exodus takes place, these are not just isolated moments. They are chapters in a larger story revealing Israel's unique role in the world. Jubilees sees this nation as a bearer of light that confronts idolatry and reveals God's will for all humanity. It is a narrative that carries both honor and responsibility. In practice, this teaches that being chosen was never just a privilege but also a burden. Just as Israel was shaped by the discipline of the Sabbath, purity, and diet, each person is also called to live their faith as a mission. Jubilees reminds us that when someone assumes the role of witness, their life cannot be banal. Even small choices echo as a testimony before the world. This centrality also explains why the text insists so much on obedience. If Israel is the guiding thread of history, any deviation affects not just a tribe or family, but the very balance of time. Therefore, falls into idolatry or rebellion were seen as cosmic threats. And it is precisely in this tension between fidelity and infidelity that the importance of fighting the forces of evil and hope in the future apocalypse emerges. But Jubilees is not limited to the past. It also points to the end of time, when Israel's role would be fully revealed and the angels would imprison the forces of evil. This eschatological vision shows that history does not move haphazardly, but moves toward a perfect restoration. The Book of Jubilees does not only speak of the past, it also looks to the future, offering a powerful eschatological vision. At the end of time, the faithful angels will be tasked with imprisoning the forces of evil, including the remnants of the corruption of the Nephilim and the actions of Mastema. The order of the universe will be restored, and everything will once again follow the perfect pattern of the heavenly tablets. It is a promise that evil, though noisy, has an expiration date. This perspective brings hope in the midst of trials. If evil seems to dominate today, Jubilees reminds us that its dominion is temporary. There will come a day when time will be reorganized according to the eternal solar calendar, and the feasts and the Sabbath will once again have their unshakable place. This restoration is seen as the great final Jubilee, where creation returns to its original balance. In practice, this vision teaches us to persevere. How often do injustices seem endless? Jubilees reminds us that every story is written, and the ending is already known, the victory of divine order over chaos. It's like watching a movie knowing that, no matter how much the villain seems to win, the hero will triumph in the final act. This certainty doesn't eliminate struggles, but it strengthens hope. An interesting detail is that this eschatology doesn't separate heaven and earth. What happens at the end of time involves both men and angels, both the visible and the invisible. God's plan is comprehensive. The kingdom is restored completely with no room for fragmentation. This shows that there is no small part in creation. Everything will be renewed. And if Jubilees points to this glorious end, it also helps us understand why the book was rejected in so many traditions. After all, its bold assertions about time, angels, and the law went against the grain of rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. The Book of Jubilees was considered dangerous by many religious leaders. Its content, while fascinating, clashed with the tradition that had become established in rabbinic Judaism and later Christianity. The emphasis on the 364-day solar calendar, for example, directly challenged the lunar calendar used in the Temple of Jerusalem. This made Jubilees almost a manifesto of opposition, arousing suspicion and rejection. Besides the calendar, the exaggerated role attributed to the angels also caused discomfort. The book portrayed them as guardians of time, teachers of law, and even warriors against evil. For many rabbis, this diverted focus from the centrality of the Torah and the direct relationship between God and the people. For later Christians, this approach seemed to diminish the uniqueness of Christ, since the functions of mediation were attributed to the angels. Another controversial point was the insistence that laws such as the Sabbath, purity, and circumcision had existed since the patriarchs. This view challenged the traditional narrative, which saw the giving of the law at Sinai as a founding moment. Jubilees, on the contrary, asserted that everything had already been written on the heavenly tablets since creation. This challenged both rabbinic authority and the idea of a new covenant in Christianity. In practice, Jubilees became a kind of uncomfortable book because it didn't fit well into any established system. Imagine a puzzle piece that insists on presenting a different picture than the one everyone wants to see. This was the fate of Jubilees, not rejected for lack of relevance but precisely because it said too much. Its content was too bold to be accepted without question. And this rejection opens the door to another interesting point. How did early Christianity react to a text that claimed the law existed before Moses? This conflict with the notion of a new covenant reveals even more tension surrounding Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees represented a challenge to early Christianity because it presented the laws as eternal, already practiced by Abraham, Noah, and even Adam. This weakened the notion that the new covenant in Christ was a break with the old. If the Sabbath, circumcision, and purity already existed before Moses, then the Christian message of freedom from the law seemed to lose strength. It was like trying to preach something new on a terrain where the old already reigned supreme. For the early Christians, the centrality was Christ as the fulfillment of the promise. Jubilees, on the other hand, insisted that Israel's practices were inscribed in the heavenly tablets, immutable and universal. This tension created a dangerous contrast. Accepting Jubilees would mean relativizing the uniqueness of Jesus' work. It's not hard to understand why Christian leaders ended up dismissing the book, classifying it as inappropriate. In practice, this shows how religious disputes are not just about faith, but also about identity. Christianity needed to differentiate itself from Judaism to grow, and Jubilees, with its solar calendar and its defense of traditions, pulled everything back to its Hebrew roots. It was as if the book were saying, nothing has changed, everything was already written. For a faith that wanted to affirm the new, this sounded like a regression. This conflict also helps to understand why Jubilees survived in specific traditions such as the Ethiopian Church, but not in the Christian canon as a whole. While some saw it as a source of wisdom and revelation, others saw it as a threat to doctrine. It is a reminder of how texts can be accepted or rejected not only for their content, but for the impact they have on theological disputes. But despite this rejection, Jubilees never completely disappeared. Fragments of it were found at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing that there were groups such as the Essenes who deeply valued it. The rediscovery of the Book of Jubilees gained even more momentum when fragments of it were found in Qumran, alongside the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. This revealed that the text was highly valued by the Essenes, a Jewish group who lived a strict discipline separated from society. For them, Jubilees made perfect sense as it defended the solar calendar, purity, and fidelity to eternal laws. This similarity shows that Jubilees was not a book forgotten in antiquity. On the contrary, it circulated among groups seeking a more intense spirituality and distrustful of the official practices of the temple in Jerusalem. The Essenes saw in Jubilees a confirmation of their lifestyle, a separate people, guided by a different time and a cosmic vision of destiny. It's interesting to see how Jubilees fits into this scenario. The Qumran fragments prove that it wasn't just a literary work, but part of a community practice. It's like a manual that justified daily choices, from counting the feasts to how to observe the diet and the Sabbath. It was more than just reading material, it was a guide to life. In practice, this makes us think about how each generation seeks texts that legitimize its journey. Just as today's groups rely on certain books or authors to reinforce their convictions, the Essenes found in Jubilees a spiritual compass. It told them what they wanted to hear, that they were right to resist the current and maintain their discipline. But this connection to Qumran also reveals another facet. Jubilees has a strong apocalyptic influence, much like other texts found in the desert, pointing to an end of times filled with spiritual battles and the restoration of the kingdom. The Book of Jubilees has a strong apocalyptic character, much like other writings found at Qumran and even the Book of Enoch. It presents history as a grand stage of struggle between good and evil angels, between order and chaos, between light and idolatry. Nothing is neutral. Every event in human life reflects this cosmic battle. This vision reinforces the idea that everything is already inscribed on the heavenly tablets and moves toward the final judgment. This apocalyptic tone is not only threatening but also hopeful. Jubilees insist that evil, represented by beings such as the Watchers, the Nephilim, and Mastema, will be defeated. In the end, the faithful angels will imprison the evil forces, and Israel will find its central place in the divine plan. It is the promise that history will not end in disorder, but in restoration. This vision nourished those living under oppression, reminding them that suffering had an expiration date. In practice, this apocalyptic mindset helped communities like the Essenes remain steadfast in their discipline. They believed that their obedience to the laws of purity, the Sabbath, and the solar calendar placed them on the side of light in the final battle. It was like soldiers in training. Every small act of obedience was part of a much larger war. This gave meaning to even everyday sacrifices, transforming the ordinary into the eternal. This emphasis also echoes in other later traditions. Many scholars see echoes in Jubilees that influenced even Christian apocalyptic literature, such as the Revelation of John. The idea of predetermined time, cycles of trials, and the ultimate victory of divine order appears in both texts. It's as if Jubilees had prepared the groundwork for a mindset that would span centuries. But this apocalyptic interpretation doesn't just stand alone. It's supported by the way Jubilees organizes time. History is divided into perfect 49-year cycles, the so-called Jubilees, demonstrating that even the future follows a divine mathematical pattern. One of the most striking features of the Book of Jubilees is its way of organizing history into 49-year blocks, known as Jubilees. Each cycle was like a gear within a great cosmic clock, showing that time was not random but followed a mathematical and spiritual structure. This reinforced the idea that everything, from creation to the apocalypse, was aligned in a perfect pattern. This way of viewing time brought security. If the festivals and events followed fixed cycles, then the people of Israel could trust that nothing escaped divine control. Jubilees showed that life was not a loose thread, but a carefully woven tapestry. For ancient readers, this vision was an antidote to uncertainty, a reminder that history always moves toward the purpose established in the heavenly tablets. In practice, this mindset can be applied to everyday life. Think of how modern calendars help us organize our lives into weeks, months, and years. Jubilees did something similar, but with a much deeper meaning. Each 49-year cycle served as a reminder that divine order manifests itself even in the passing of days. It's as if each time stamp was a reminder that we are living within a grand celestial agenda. This concept also shaped communal spirituality. By living within this cyclical reckoning, people were aware that they were part of a greater plan. Each generation was connected to the previous and the next like links in a chain. Nothing was lost, nothing was wasted. This vision gave weight to even the simplest moments, transforming the ordinary into part of an eternal narrative. But if time was already organized in perfect cycles, then the Torah itself needed to be seen not as a novelty, but as part of something eternal. This is why Jubilees insists on the continuity of the law, showing that it was not only born at Sinai, but was already present from the beginning of time. In the Book of Jubilees, the Torah is not presented as a new revelation at Sinai, but as part of an eternal truth that already existed since creation. The laws of the Sabbath, purity, circumcision, and diet were already observed by the patriarchs long before Moses. This shows that the giving of the Torah was, in fact, a renewal and not a novelty. It was the remembrance of something that was inscribed on the heavenly tablets from the beginning. This view reinforces the idea that the law is a reflection of divine order, not a cultural imposition. For Jubilees, obedience is not simply fulfilling commandments, but aligning oneself with time and cosmic destiny. Just as the stars follow a fixed course in the sky, humanity should walk according to these eternal laws. Sin, therefore, was more than disobedience, it was a rupture with the very harmony of the universe. In practice, this makes us reflect on the importance of constancy. It's not about obeying only when convenient, but about making discipline a lifestyle. Think, for example, of someone who follows a healthy exercise or reading routine. The value lies not just in the isolated act, but in the continuity that shapes character. Jubilees shows that the law works in the same way, structuring life toward purpose. This interpretation also explains the steadfastness of the Essenes and other ancient communities that followed rigid rules. For them, the law was not a burden but a privilege, living in harmony with what was already written in the heavens. This gave meaning to even the simplest practices, such as eating rituals or periods of rest. Everything was part of a grand system of order, revelation, and holiness. But if the law was eternal, how can we understand the actions of evil forces and figures like Mastema? Jubilees answers by reminding us that even these accusers did not act on their own, but within divine permission, like pieces on a cosmic chessboard. In the Book of Jubilees, Mastema, a figure equivalent to Satan, is not portrayed as an absolute enemy, but as someone subordinate to God's will. He only acts when given permission, and his role is to test people, expose their weaknesses, and serve as an accuser. This is the same logic we see in the Book of Job, where the adversary is not independent, but a limited agent within the destiny already written on the heavenly tablets. This perspective is uncomfortable but revealing. Rather than imagining a war between equal forces, Jubilees shows that evil is always limited by divine sovereignty. There is no perfect dualism. God remains in control. Mastema can tempt Abraham, interfere in history, or bring trials, but always within a defined framework. He is like a stern teacher who administers difficult tests, but only to reveal what the student has already learned. This perspective also helps us reinterpret life's crises. We often think we're being unfairly attacked, but Jubilees suggest that even moments of trial have a purpose. They reveal resilience, shape character, and strengthen hope. If even rebellious angels are under authority, this means that no pain escapes the Creator's gaze. Even trials are part of spiritual formation. In practice, this can be seen when we face situations that seem unbearable. Instead of simply asking, "Why did this happen?" we can reflect, "What do I need to learn from this?" This is the central point of Jubilees. Mastema is not an enemy out of control, but an instrument, albeit a painful one, to push us toward growth. But Jubilees doesn't stop there. It also shows parallels with other ancient texts, such as the Book of Enoch, which expands on the story of the fall of the angels and offers an alternative cosmology that strongly resonates with its narrative. The Book of Jubilees has a direct connection with the Book of Enoch, another ancient text that also expanded on biblical stories. Both speak of the fall of the angels, the origin of the Nephilim, and the spiritual impact caused by the rebellion of the Watchers. This connection shows that there was a parallel tradition circulating among Jewish communities, offering a different cosmology than the one that later consolidated in Rabbinic Judaism. While Genesis mentions the events briefly, Jubilees and Enoch detail them, almost like hidden chapters of history. They reveal the spiritual backdrop behind humanity's corruption and reinforce the idea that everything was already foreseen in the heavenly tablets. It's like watching an extended version of a movie. The additional details help to better understand the plot. This connection also helps explain why the Essenes at Qumran valued these texts so highly. For them, both Enoch and Jubilees confirmed their worldview based on purity, the solar calendar, and the expectation of an imminent apocalypse. Both works offered hope and instruction for those who believed they were already living in the end times. In practice, this shows us that the spirituality of the Second Temple period was much richer and more diverse than we often imagine. There were different currents interpreting the same tradition, each emphasizing different aspects. Jubilees and Enoch formed a kind of alternative library, offering answers to questions that the official text did not address in detail. But this connection wasn't just a thing of the past. To this day, the Ethiopian Church preserves both books in its canon, demonstrating how they continue to influence spirituality and even practices related to the solar calendar. This continuity leads us to reflect on the impact Jubilees still has on Ethiopian tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the only Christian branch that has maintained the Book of Jubilees as an official part of its canon. For them, the text was not merely an ancient curiosity, but a living revelation that continued to shape liturgical and spiritual practices. The use of the solar calendar, for example, is echoed in the Ethiopian tradition, which preserved fixed feasts and celebrations according to this system. It is as if the vision of Jubilees has survived through the centuries to this day. This impact demonstrates the strength of a tradition that has resisted oblivion. While in the West, Jubilees was considered apocryphal and fell into disuse, in Ethiopia it continued to be read and respected. This not only ensured its preservation but also gave Ethiopians a distinct spirituality, marked by references that other churches had neglected. It is like a treasure kept secret for centuries. The presence of Jubilees in Ethiopia also reinforces the importance of diversity in early Christianity. What was rejected in one place flourished in another. This reminds us that the history of faith is not linear, but full of ramifications. Often what is considered heresy by some becomes foundational for others. Ethiopian continuity shows that there is not just one way to experience revelation. In practice, this impact can be seen in the way the Ethiopian Church views the Sabbath, the rules of purity, and even the expectation of the apocalypse. For them, these elements are not simply ancient traditions, but eternal truths that structure community life. This creates a strong identity that spans generations and connects the present to the remote past of the patriarchs. But it is precisely this permanence that makes us understand why many ancient leaders considered Jubilees dangerous. After all, maintaining a text that alters the liturgical season and the interpretation of the law could be seen as a risk of heresy. For many religious leaders, the Book of Jubilees represented a real risk of heresy. The reason was simple: it undermined the foundations that supported both Rabbinic Judaism and nascent Christianity. By defending the 364-day solar calendar, for example, Jubilees directly challenged the official system based on the lunar calendar. This wasn't just a question of dates, but of spiritual authority. Whoever controlled time also controlled religious life. Another point of tension was the role given to the angels. Jubilees attributed to them functions as guardians of time, teachers of law, and fighters against evil. To the rabbis and church fathers, this seemed exaggerated, almost an indirect idolatry. Placing the angels so centrally could have distracted attention from the Torah and, later, from Christ. Thus, the text came to be seen as dangerous to the purity of faith. The insistence that the laws existed before Moses was also controversial. This challenged the narrative that the giving of the Torah at Sinai was the great milestone of revelation. And for Christianity, it weakened the notion that the new covenant had brought something unprecedented. In other words, Jubilees seemed to disrupt the foundations on which these traditions were being built. In practice, this risk of heresy translated into exclusion. The book was set aside, classified as apocryphal, and practically banished from the main traditions. But the fact that it was preserved by the Ethiopian Church shows that the concept of heresy depends largely on who has the power to define what is accepted. What is rejected in one place may be considered sacred in another. And it is precisely this tension that sparks modern interest. If Jubilees was rejected because it was too bold, what can it teach us today? Why do current scholars consider it a window into understanding debates from the Second Temple period? Today, the Book of Jubilees is studied not only as a historical curiosity, but as a key to understanding debates from the Second Temple period. It highlights the tensions between groups that defended the solar calendar, purity, and strict discipline, versus those who followed the lunar calendar and official temple tradition. For scholars, this is like finding records of a lost debate, revealing disputes that shaped Judaism and even influenced early Christianity. Furthermore, Jubilees is valuable because it illuminates how apocalyptic and alternative texts circulated in communities like Qumran. It helps to better understand the Essene mindset and its connection to works like the Book of Enoch. This network of parallel writings shows us that the Bible did not emerge in isolation, but within a rich landscape full of competing interpretations. Understanding this is fundamental for anyone studying comparative religion or the history of spirituality. In practice, Jubilees also raises contemporary questions. If laws like the Sabbath, purity, and circumcision were seen as eternal, how can this be reconciled with the modern notion of relativism? And if time truly follows cosmic patterns, what does this mean for a generation that often lives without rhythm or discipline? These reflections directly impact daily life and the search for balance. Another fascinating point is how Jubilees teaches us to look at time differently. In an era when many feel lost, chasing clocks and schedules, the book reminds us that there is a higher order, a destiny that cannot be confused. Studying Jubilees today is an invitation to align with cycles of purpose, not just human deadlines. And perhaps it's precisely this boldness that continues to attract modern readers. Jubilees is not just an ancient book, but a challenge. What if we're living outside the correct calendar? What if there are secrets hidden in history, erased by religious interests? These questions open doors to new discoveries and a deeper personal search. Now that you've learned the secrets of the Book of Jubilees, the big question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you treat it merely as a historical curiosity, or will you reflect on how your own life needs order, discipline, and a greater alignment with the eternal purpose? Think about it. If even angels keep the Sabbath and if even time obeys cosmic cycles, can we continue living without direction, chasing the human clock and forgetting God's calendar? And what's more, if texts like this were rejected because they contained uncomfortable revelations, isn't it time for you to also question traditions you've accepted without thinking? What modern idols still need to be torn down so you can live in spiritual freedom? I want to hear from you. Which part surprised you the most? Was it the idea of the solar calendar, Mastema's actions, or the fact that even the patriarchs obeyed laws before Moses? Write in the comments because your perspective may inspire others to reflect as well. And of course, don't forget, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video. Here we continue to unravel the hidden mysteries of faith, so that you never look at sacred history the same way again.